Senator Malcolm.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here. Good to see you again, Mr Hare. Is it true that when considering performance monitoring and reporting, it was found in the recent audit that the National Recovery and Resilience Agency and the National Emergency Management Agency do not have appropriate arrangements to monitor and report against the Disaster Recovery Arrangements 2018 determination principles?
Carla Jago, Group Executive Director, Performance Audit. Yes, that's correct, Senator. That's what we concluded.
Does this mean that effective monitoring and reporting on implementation of reviews did not occur and that appropriate governance for these activities was not established?
It wasn't that they hadn't necessarily occurred, that they weren't monitoring and then reporting on them, and we've made recommendations. Weren't monitoring that they had happened.
Okay, so there's no way of finding out whether or not it had happened. Okay. Is it true that the audit found that the National Recovery and Resilience Agency and the National Emergency Management Agency portfolio budget statements do not accurately describe performance information on all aspects of disaster recovery arrangements, funding arrangements?
Yes, that's what we identified.
Does this mean that this inaccurate information prevents the Parliament from understanding the allocation of resources to outcomes or to provide a sound basis for the disaster recovery financing arrangements related performance reporting?
Yes, so the purpose of performance information in portfolio budget statements and then annual report performance statements is to provide Parliament that type of information.
Right. So there's no basis for the reports in inaccuracies.
So what we concluded was that their portfolio budget statements did not accurately describe the disaster recovery funding arrangements.
Thank you. Is it true that
I think no basis is a bit stronger than what the audit found.
So they're questionable. They can't be relied upon.
I think it was. It wasn't a complete finding that across the board everything wasn't reliable.
Yes, the performance information didn't cover all aspects of their activities and their DRFA administration.
Thank you. Is it true that the Commonwealth Performance Framework requires agencies, including the National Recovery and Resilience Agency and the National Emergency Management Agency, to report on their performance in achieving their purposes, and that failure of the entities to effectively do so is a breach of the disaster recovery funding arrangement?
So I think, Senator, the framework is that there's a PGPA rule that requires the Public Governance and Performance Accountability Act, which is the Finance Act, if you like, in the sector. It has a rule made under it by the Finance Minister that requires agencies to present performance information in a performance statement every year. And that flows from what they say in their PBS through their corporate plan, and then in their annual report they pull together a performance statement. There may be some additional reporting requirements in different arrangements, like funding arrangements. What we look at when we do these audits is that rules framework, and what we've recommended to this organisation is to improve its performance monitoring and reporting. There were some gaps in completeness and accuracy. It wasn't a complete mess. It was not as good as it could be.
Okay, some deficiencies.
Yeah.
After the disaster recovery funding arrangement review that occurred from June 20th, June 2021, where the National Recovery and Resilience Agency became responsible for implementing the review, is it true that ANAO found that of the 12 updates that were actionable to achieve improvements, 6 did not include timeframes for completion, and of the 6 that did have timeframes, 4 timeframes were not met and only 2 were partially met?
Just finding that
Just
information.
trying to find. Do you have a paragraph reference that you're pointing
No, I
to?
don't.
No, so she's just going to try and find it for you, Senator.
That sounded correct. I'm just trying to find the reference in the report.
I love you guys. Nothing is what's the word? It has to be accurate, which is good.
I may need to come back to you on that one, Senator. I'll just look for it.
I'll go on then. Is it true that in February 2023, yet another review into Australia's disaster funding arrangements, including the disaster recovery funding arrangements, was announced?
Oh, the post-act audit, is it 2023? Was there an announcement in 2023 of another review of funding arrangements?
Yes, at paragraph 4.36, we note that in February 2023, the Australian Government announced a review into Australia's disaster funding arrangements, including the DRFA.
Thank you.
And just on your previous question, Senator, paragraph 4.34 sets out the information. So descriptions for each of the 4 deliverables were not consistently presented, with minor changes reducing or modifying the activities across 3 documents. For 12 updates, 6 did not include timeframes for completion of the deliverable, and of the 6 updates that did include a timeframe, 4 timeframes were not met and 2 were partially met.
Okay, thank you. Isn't all this clear evidence of the disarray of the state of disaster relief funding that I raised in the Senate in 2019 and repeatedly since? There appears to be a total failure of governance in this program.
Our overall conclusion was that the agencies, and we collectively called the agencies that were responsible over time the agencies' administration of the processes for the disaster recovery funding arrangements and the associated assurance activities were largely effective. There were some areas that could be improved though, and those are the areas that you've touched on.
Okay. So I still call for a Senate inquiry, Chair, into the administration of disaster recovery funding, with more particular emphasis on the dubious, some would say corrupt practices that misuse the funds. Could I now turn to, I want to change tack and pursue another matter of concern that I've also been raising for the last 4 years. Coal LSL, Coal Long Service Leave, is the agency that carries the responsibility for administering and collecting levies related to long service entitlements for coal miners and paying out claims. I've been raising concerns about the inaccuracy and unreliability of records and payments made to coal miners working in and leaving the black coal industry. And I'll be raising this again when Coal LSL comes up next week. In 2022, the accounting firm KPMG completed a review of Coal LSL and located many fundamental errors in recording and processing workers' hours and categories. 30 recommendations were made and apparently accepted by the government. More than 200 employers were identified who had not submitted levies. So a massive problem was identified. Lack of governance is an issue, and that has been an issue that I've exposed in Senate estimates after Senate estimates. Simple question. Are you prepared to consider conducting an audit of Coal LSL in the light of the governance problems identified in the KPMG review?
I think, Senator, we've said in the past that if members of Parliament request us to do an audit, we'll look and see whether there's reasonable grounds for doing that. I'm happy to have a look at it. It hasn't come up in any of our considerations in my time. We do a financial audit of the organisation each year, and my understanding is that hasn't come up with any findings with respect to financial reporting, but I'm happy to have a look at the issues.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Roberts.